Thank you, Terry. I might want that, might I? Thank you. So, as when I was NAPF chairman, I'm trying to live up to what Terry did before me, and Robin as well, both ex-NAPF chairs. I'll do my best this morning. Welcome to me. Thank you for having me. Many familiar faces and hopefully friends around the room. As Terry said, I'm going to talk to you about a change program we've been undergoing at Rail. And I hope there'll be at least some things in it that you think, oh, that strikes a chord with me, or there's some relevance for that there. I'll concentrate particularly on the cost element, but it's a much bigger thing than that. So, what do? I click this button right, do I? Okay, good. So a bit of background, you have to have this because I like trains. So some of you will know that the Railways Pension Scheme is a unitised, sectionalised, industry-wide scheme. Not many like it in the UK. We'll go through the history in a minute, but basically you can think of it like 110 schemes stuck together, because each employer in the railway industry, and they all have, and there are a lot of them, they all have their separate bit of the scheme. But to try and drive the economies of scale, the scheme is organised so that we pool the assets into our own pooled vehicles. But overall, there are 350,000 members, assets probably about 21 billion at the moment, I think, as markets push back to their previous highs in the last century. It's mostly DB. There is some DC, partly AVCs, partly standalone DC, where employers feel that's the best thing for their members, or best thing for their business. My approach to DC, certainly in the rail context, is to try and do it as much as possible in the same way as we do DB. So we actually pool the assets for the DC members together with the assets for the DB members. It seems to me that whether the promise is a DC promise or a DB promise, you're trying to produce long-term growth in real terms and hopefully not too many bumps along the way. So that much to me is reasonably well aligned. So how did we get to having this, this structure? Well, you have to start quite a long way back. I'd start 190 years ago, really. The Stockton and Darlington Railway opened, and that was the first railway in the world. And Darlington's particularly relevant because that's where we do all our administration. But that's really where the story started. And they didn't get around to thinking about provisions for their employees until, well, 23 years later. That's when the first Railway Friendly Society started. Elsewhere in Europe, there was revolution breaking out all over the place. France was deposing its monarch for the second time, or possibly third time, setting up its second republic. In the UK, we were setting up friendly societies. Doesn't that say it all? And then not a lot happened for another 100 years until the railways were nationalised. And that's important because that was really when we got to create the economy of scale in railway pensions. That's really what led to the privatised scheme being a collective scheme when privatisation happened in 1994. In between there, 1965, that's important because I was born that year, but also what happened was that British Rail happened to move its pensions department to the aforementioned Darlington. We reside in Darlington in a very impressive, it looks like a brick scale model of Buckingham Palace actually. It was built in 1911 for the chief mechanical engineer of the North Eastern Railway, Vincent Lichfield Raven. And it's clear that he thought quite a lot of himself. Rumour has it that in those days there was a track up to the back of the building, and he arrived to work on his own train. Whether that's true, I can no longer substantiate. We've built houses all over it. But anyway, I think this is just interesting background, really. But it just goes to show the railways were like the Google or the Apple of their day. You know, they really thought they were the bee's knees, right? So I think we all need to we all just need to think a bit about how temporary everything is, really. The railways continue, but the companies that ran them are no more. I will get there eventually, Terry. So anyway, that's about the Railways Pension Scheme, but what about investing? Because that's more specifically my theme today. Well, those of you with long memories will know that the Railways Pension Scheme used to be famous for its art. This is mostly before my time, I have to say, but it was invested in back in 1975-ish, 75, 76, at a time when UK had very high inflation, mid-20% per annum, and there were no index-linked gilts at that time, so there were no obvious stores of value. The UK stock market was down about 2/3, for those of you that remember those times. What could they invest in? They thought they'd buy some old masters, and a load of other old rubbish as well, actually. But overall, they managed to generate a return of inflation plus 4% over the 20 years of the fund. That was mainly because they had some impressionist paintings amongst their cartloads, and they became very popular in the late 80s. So anyway, we used to be known for our innovation and investment. I would say that over the years, we've rather lost our mojo, if I'm perfectly honest. In 1987, the investment of the fund was outsourced. This is still before my time, by the way. Why was it outsourced? Well, a thing happened in London around then, the big bang in the city, where the old jobbers and brokers were deregulated. And the feeling that my forebears had then was that it would no longer be possible to manage money in the city on terms and conditions which were related back to what train drivers got. That was their thinking, and that's why they outsourced the management, with perfectly good reason, I guess. But I suppose what's happened since then is inevitable. They realised quickly that they needed to have some sort of in-house capability, so they employed people like me with an investment consulting background, and we brought ideas about specialisation and complification and hedge funds and LDI, all those sorts of things, to the point where if you looked at our fund a few years ago, well, even relatively recently, it was really, really quite complex. And in the course of doing that, I suspect we'd lost a lot of the economies of scale that we had to begin with, which I'm not particularly proud of, but it was the zeitgeist of the day. So what brought us to our senses? It was really the global financial crisis, I guess. Not that specifically. I mean, we had a pretty torrid 2008, 2009, but we're a long-term fund. You can actually trade through those dips in capital values, can't you? It was more the realization following that what people at PIMCO started calling the new normal meant we were into an era of probably lower returns for quite a long time. And at that point, you just have to be much more focused. You have to be much more coherent about the way you look after your assets and not give returns away unnecessarily. So what did we do? Well, we decided to embark on a change program, which we called imaginatively ITP, Investment Transformation Program. And again, for enthusiasts in railways, the logo here, it reflects the logos on Great Western Railway locomotives in the 1930s. Those colours and that way of that font. Okay, it's just me, isn't it, really? The Great Western Railway is quite a good case in point, though. I mean, some of you may know that there was a man in the 1850s called Isambard Kingdom Brunel who basically built the Great Western Railway, and he built steamships to go across the Atlantic, built the first suspension bridge, the first tunnel under the Severn, all sorts of stuff like that. Really great, innovative engineering, pioneer of his day, and I suppose in some ways I aspire to us being that sort of fund, really, if we want to be a world-class asset owner. But, you know, even pioneers and world-class people like Isambard Kingdom Brunel don't get everything right. So one thing about the Great Western Railway that you may or may not know is that in those days it ran on rails which were 6 feet apart, called broad gauge. And this was great because it meant you could have big carriages, big stable locomotives, and it was a smoother ride for the passengers. Unfortunately, everyone else was using rails which were 4 feet, 8.5 or something like that. So it was very much the Betamax of its day. It was technologically superior, but just it just got outnumbered, basically, and they had to change eventually. I will get to the investment. Probably about now. How am I doing for time, Terry? Am I? Okay, that's fine. Good. So we embarked on this change program. I wouldn't say that we had everyone on board for that. It wasn't like we were doing things really badly before. But we had enough people around the place, enough trustee directors who thought that a new way of doing things was the right way to go. And we knew we'd need some outside help, so we actually involved, when I was talking about consultants, we actually involved Roger Irwin, not because he's Towers Watson and they'd been the actuaries of the scheme since 1923 or something, but because we knew we needed someone with a broad range of knowledge, I guess. And so he helped me quite a lot in formulating some of this. It was around adapting ourselves to a new world where returns were lower, yields were lower. Interestingly, that's not what's happened recently. The longest dated index-linked gilt produced a return of 70-something% last year. It can't go on, can it? But I've been wrong about that for 12 years and counting, I would say. But we had to really get on board with making quite a big commitment to change. And we spent a lot of 2013 formulating what we thought change looked like. We spent all of 2014 trying to put it into effect and hoping that markets didn't get ahead of us. And we had a lot of stakeholders to bring along. As I said earlier, it's 110 schemes stitched together, so a lot of people to brief. So what did we actually do? Well, we did a lot of different things, but they encompassed governance and implementation and really culture, I guess. So the governance part, well, it's a good idea. I'm sure many of you do revisit your investment beliefs from time to time. And to be honest, we've never done that very successfully in the past. They've always ended up a bit of a mishmash. This time we really went back to basics and said, well, what is it that makes us us, and what's our competitive advantage? And we thought that was really being able to be more long-term than many other people. By the way, quite a bit of the scheme, many of my members are in sections of the scheme which are open to new entrants, not just open to new accruals. So that makes us unusual. And what else? Well, that means that we can be patient. We don't have to mark benchmarks necessarily when they're going in the wrong direction. So one of our beliefs is we'll be patient but ready to act. Quite what that means we're still working through. In governance terms, we have a representational trustee board, 16 trustee directors, all elected from the rail industry. They had their own investment committee. They had a whole suite of committees to run the scheme, as you would expect. They recognised, actually, that that wasn't the best way to achieve investment excellence. So they voluntarily agreed to disband their investment committee and instead to delegate through to a professional investment board, which is a much smaller body, staffed by professional non-executives with investment experience, but also experience of institutions. And their job is to hold me and hold my team to account much more closely than a trustee body could. Happy to go into that under questions if you wish. Now, I mentioned value chain here. This is really what we called cost recognition and net value add. It's not just about cutting costs, although Terry, that's clearly an important part of it. You know, I don't feel it's true that trustees don't hold their providers to account to get the best fees. I know mine do, I know we do, but I've always felt it's a bit like when you buy a house, you know. The house is advertised for 200,000 or more like 2 million in London, I guess. And so that sort of sets your expectations as anchoring goes on. And so you do negotiate, and you might get 5% off, 10% off in the right circumstances. But you may have started the negotiation in completely the wrong place, you know? And that's what happens with our investment management fees, I feel. So we're always really pleased that we can get hedge funds for, I don't know, 1.9 and 19 rather than 2 and 20. But that's kind of missing the point, really, isn't it? So we went back to basics again there and said, well, what's the value add we're getting, and what's the best way to get at that? I'll probably skip over this in the interests of time. We we've rebuilt all our investment processes, basically, emphasizing long-termism and scale, as I've said. Now, the thing about long-termism, this is what John Maynard Keynes said: the long run is a misleading guide to world affairs. In the long run, we're all dead, as indeed he proved to be in 1946. And in similar vein, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. Yeah, but we're optimists, though. We're going to try. We're going to try, and we hope we have a better chance than maybe the average investor. So that's our competitive edge. I'm very much taken also by Benjamin Graham's quote, who's probably even older than John Maynard Keynes, that in the short term the markets are a voting machine, but in the long term they're a weighing machine. So you want to be getting the long-term value and not the short-term. But John Maynard Keynes, I think he also said, Terry, and this really goes to your JFK comment, he said it's easier to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally, which is the obverse of JFK's you'll get your comeuppance in the end, I think, was the essence of that, wasn't it? So it is all about time frame, again. We're trying to lengthen out our time frames and not just be stuck with what the pensions regulator or the accounting profession, or whoever it might be, thinks is an appropriate time frame to measure things over. I'll skate over this too. This is the way we structured our internal investment team. I mean, clearly we have a bigger team than most UK funds, although we're quite small fry in international terms. But my point really is we're not trying to replicate what happens in the wider fund management industry. We're trying to do something which works specifically for us. Cost analysis, I've got there in the end. Terry, you mentioned external benchmarking, and we do use some of the firms and mechanisms that you talked about, and in particular we get CEM to measure our pensions costs. They measure our admin costs as well, actually, and they're very good if you're ever looking for an administrator. Am I not supposed to do that?
Doesn't matter now.
It's too late. But I would say with all these things, they find what can be found. They don't necessarily find what's difficult to find. And we've ended up investing through a lot of funds, through a lot of pooled vehicles. I mean, hedge funds are obviously one example. Private equity funds are another. But in quoted markets as well, you often find you're in collective vehicles, even if you're a big investor. And we found that the costs that get deducted from inside those funds, without you ever seeing them, actually, in our case, amounted to 3 times what we thought we were paying. Well, I'm exaggerating slightly. It's not that we didn't know about them at all, but we were genuinely stunned at the size of them. And some of that's things like performance share in private equity funds, but some of it's payment for services to companies inside the fund that you wouldn't really necessarily think of being levied on the end investor. So, we thought we were not a low-cost fund. We have a lot of active management, but a reasonably economical fund. And when we really dug into it, we found that actually we're not. And why does that matter? It didn't used to matter when we expected double-digit returns every year. But in the new normal, when you don't expect large returns, as you said, Terry, it's much more important to focus on with certain costs and not just the uncertain investment returns. Now, I should say what we haven't focused on so far is the top red bar in that bar chart on the right, the transaction costs. What I've been talking about are deductions from funds that are made by the general partners or managers of those funds. We do get our transaction costs measured. They're clearly a further drag on performance. We will get there eventually. I'm loath to say that we're going to bear down on them because I think it depends entirely on the style of the manager you're employing. Generally speaking, if we're a long-term investor, we shouldn't be churning assets unnecessarily. And actually, we think we have a place in our portfolio for just buying some shares or bonds on whatever it might be and just putting them in a drawer, because that's a way of getting rid of costs altogether. But I would say about transaction costs, I'm less worried about the costs which are levied by my investment managers, by my external investment managers, than I am worried by the ones which are effectively charged to my fund by the wholesale traders in the city. I think I'm the only person in the UK that thought a financial transaction tax was possibly a good idea, and James violently disagrees with me about this, I should say. But my thinking was, yes, okay, so if our fund managers have to pay a tax on transactions, we'll end up paying it, I get that. But if it stops high-frequency trading, if it stops churning by investment bank trading platforms, then that will be a bigger benefit to my fund, because the profits they're generating, they don't come out of thin air, they come from somewhere. They must come from the end investors, from my pension fund members, from your pension fund members. There's nowhere else for them to come from, it seems to me. Anyway, I won't go on about that further, James, or we might get into a fight. And that would be unseemly. So what are we doing? Well, we've actually employed someone full-time now to actually look at our transaction costs. I mean, clearly that's something we can do with our scale. We wanted to call him our forensic cost accountant, but that wasn't allowed. It was too close to one of those TV programs about dead bodies. My finance director didn't like that idea. But anyway, that's the job. And we're going to keep digging. But that discovery is one thing. The other thing is what do you do about it? And what we're trying to do is we're trying to basically, whenever we want to get access to a return driver going forwards, we're going to think to ourselves, well, what's the most effective, cost-effective way to access that return driver? And it might still be to employ an active manager, and we will, but it might just be, as I've said, let's buy a stock, let's buy a bond, or let's use an alternative risk premium which we can access through an ETF or something like that. This is our way of talking about smart beta, by the way. You'll no doubt know all about smart beta. I don't like calling it smart because that feels rather hubristic to me. I'm sure it's going to come a cropper one year. But we do think that there are many risk premia hidden inside active managers' returns, which you can unpack, and you can get them much more cheaply than by employing the manager. So our assessment of whether a manager is adding value going forwards will be, let's unpack all those things which can be got at by other means, alternative risk premia, etc., and work out what share the manager is being paid of the net added return after that. And when you do that analysis, you very often find that there's not much left for the fund once the manager's taken their fees. So that's what we're doing. What can you do? I do think it's important, as Terry was saying earlier, to understand the true cost of investing, and there are many ways of doing that. The transaction cost disclosure guide is a good way to start. I mean, relentlessly asking questions of your fund managers gets you quite a long way, I think, but you probably do need some specialist advice as well. I would encourage everyone to be generally sceptical of complexity. I speak with the zeal of a convert. Most of us, we think we're professional people. We tend to like complex stuff, I'm an actuary, right? Nothing delights me more than having a really intricate page of stuff to actually wade through. But it's not necessarily in my members' interests. Because if someone's making something complex, it presents them with an opportunity, whether they intended it to or not. And inevitably, if we present humans with an opportunity, they will sometimes take the opportunity. And I would also say focus on your goals, not what everyone else does. That's very, very important. There aren't many funds in the UK which look like ours these days, shooting for optimistic long-term real return targets. But you will have your own goals, and you should buy just the kind of thing that you need for that. In the past, I would say we've tried to do a bit of everything, and that remains a tendency. It's a bit the same sort of thing, Something really interesting over here that someone's trying to sell to me, then the tendency is, oh, well, that sounds really good. It'd be really interesting to see what that's like. No, don't do it. Don't do it unless you need it. And if you need it, then have lots. So, I do think we are travelling in the right direction, although there is a long way to go. I mean, I take some credit for the cost cap on DC. I think Pensions Quality Mark, which I am director, first came up with this, and it was then adopted by Steve Webb and the government. And it does feel like a sledgehammer, but the nut it's trying to crack has proved a very tough one, so I think that's entirely justified. But there are other straws in the wind. I mean, I've been a trustee at Nest, as Terry said, and the procurement that they did, clearly based around the fact that it and other such auto-enrollment vehicles would grow very large over time, has set a new benchmark for where fees should be set. But my final comment, though, would be that fund managers, it feels like I'm beating them up a bit. I don't really mean to. I see fund managers are really the solution here. They're the guys on our side as we fight against the rest of the investment services chain. As I said, don't get me started on high-frequency traders and the like. I think that's where the real problems are. So, returning to a rail analogy, I would hope that the light at the end of the tunnel need not be an oncoming train. Thank you very much.